Author and international speaker, Jay Seegert holds degrees in both physics and engineering technology. As founder of the Starting Point Project, Jay passionately seeks to help people establish a biblical worldview based on the authority of Scripture. For more than 30 years, he has been graciously tackling tough questions regarding the Christian faith, especially in the often intimidating world of science, bringing it down to a level that everyone can understand. We trust you will enjoy this presentation as Jay delivers a fascinating talk entitled Dinosaurs in the Bible, Part 2.
Thanks for joining us for Part 2 of a 3-part series on dinosaurs and the Bible. I'm going to make the assumption that you've seen Part 1 and you didn't cheat and go right to Part 2. We covered a lot of foundational information in Part 1 as to why in the world are we even talking about dinosaurs. It's really not ultimately about dinosaurs. It's about our view of the authority of God's Word. Do we really trust everything that it says? Or do we go somewhere else to get truth and then import that into God's Word and tell Him, in essence, what He actually meant? I believe that we can trust the Bible from cover to cover, and it should be our starting point for whatever topic is brought up, even dinosaurs. So as a way of review, in Part 1, these are the 3 major questions we covered in addition to why this is important. Why isn't the word dinosaur in the Bible? And when were dinosaurs created? And were they actually vicious meat eaters? Now in Part 2, we'll look at these 3 questions. How old are dinosaur fossils? Did dinosaurs turn into oil? And then did dinosaurs and man actually live together? 3 important questions. Let's jump right in here. How old are dinosaur fossils? Again, we bring back the crazy meter. This makes people think it's crazy to talk about anything other than dinosaurs having existed millions and millions of years ago, which is certainly what we learn from the public school system and the secular media and the scientific journals. A related question to this is, how do they date dinosaur fossils? That's probably even more important than just how old they tell us they are. How are they determining these things to begin with? Well, it's interesting, when they dig up a dinosaur bone, they don't find a tag on it with its age, 65 million years old. The scientists have to make up a name for the dinosaur, which is usually okay, but then often they are kind of making up an age, which is not so much okay. So let's take a look at what they do to come up with these ages. Well, you take the actual bones that they found, and then you find a laboratory where they can do some dating. It's interesting, is the first question the person in the lab is probably going to ask is, where did you find this thing? Meaning, in the geologic column, what layer did you find it in? So we've got the geologic column here. We're not going to talk about that in any great detail other than to say there are a lot of layers out there. They've given names to the layers, and they've assigned ages to the layers largely before they even invented radiometric dating. Why does the person in the lab want to know where they found it? Because they want to know how old it's supposed to be. So they say, oh, we found it at the top of the Cretaceous here. Well, that's about 65 million years ago. Now they have a target. Dinosaurs, they say, died out about 65 million years ago. This is a dinosaur bone. So we're expecting it to be about 65 million years old. They have a target in mind. Okay, then they say, well, you know what? Oh, the bone is too old to date. Well, wait a minute. We're trying to find out how old this bone is. How are you telling us that it's actually too old to date? You don't know that yet. That's the whole point. We're trying to come up with a date. Well, they say, well, if it's a dinosaur bone and it died out 65 million years ago, there wouldn't be anything left in the bone for us to use to do dating. You can't use carbon-14 dating on dinosaur bones. That's their mindset. So they'll set the bone aside. Okay? I know, maybe they're dating the rock layer where they found the fossil. No, that doesn't work either, because these are sedimentary layers, and you can't use radiometric dating techniques on sedimentary layers because they're fragments of other rocks. So we have to throw that out. Okay, well, then they bring in a nearby igneous rock that was by the layer where the fossil was found. Now, we're kind of disconnected from the original fossil here, but you can do radiometric dating on igneous rocks. So they bring that rock into the laboratory, and they have a number of different techniques that they can use to come up with ages. So let's say they use the uranium lead method, and that determines that, oh, it's 1.1 billion years old. Wait a minute, our target is 65 million years old, so that can't be right. So they'll say, okay, well, obviously something went wrong there. We can write that off. And we're not going to go through the details of how radiometric dating works. We do that in other series here. But their first try at this, something went wrong there. We can dismiss that. So then they do rubidium strontium dating, and that says 103,000 years old. Well, that's way too young. Probably some contamination went on there. We can write that off. Then they use fission track dating, and maybe that's 25 million years old. Well, getting closer, but still, we know that that's wrong. We can throw that out. Then finally, they do potassium-argon dating, and it comes up with 67 million years. Oh, it's pretty close. We were thinking it was about 65 million years old. Potassium-argon dates it at 67 million years old. So then the news article comes out and says they discovered a dinosaur fossil. That's actually correct. It was a dinosaur. They felt it was a T-Rex. Pretty straightforward. I agree with that too. They found a T-Rex. They expected it would be about 65 million years old. According to their belief system and evolution and all that, yeah, that's what they would expect. That's correct as well. Then they used potassium-argon dating method on it, 67 million years old, and the public is impressed. After you know the background of this, you yourself are probably not so impressed anymore. They're kind of cherry picking what they want. They know what it's supposed to be, and they keep doing techniques until they find something as close. Then they publish that, and again, the unsuspecting public thinks, wow, those guys are so smart. How do they figure that out? I don't know. I'm not that smart. But it's science, and you can't argue with that. They've got radiometric dating, and you can't question that. That's kind of how the process works. Well, are there any evidences that maybe these bones aren't so old? I'm going to give you a few indicators that tell us these bones in no way can be hundreds of thousands or millions or older than that. Millions and millions of years old. That's the standard story. Well, first of all, we find these dinosaur bones that are still fresh. Here's a quote from an evolutionist. He said, bones do not have to be turned into stone to be fossils, and usually most of the original bone is still present in a dinosaur fossil. That's very surprising to people. Wait a minute, dinosaur bones are millions of years old. They should have turned into a fossil a long time ago. And that's true, they should have, but most of them are still fresh. Then we have this, further in the quote, modern bones that fall into mineral springs can become permineralized or fossilized within a matter of weeks. It can happen in weeks, so if the bones are really 65 million years old, they should have fossilized a long time ago, but most of them are still fresh. Then we have carbon-14 related to carbon-14 dating. I'm not going to go through all the details right now, but carbon-14 is created in our atmosphere and it gets into all living things. And it decays away at a rate that after just a few tens of thousands of years, it would be completely gone. Well, if the bones of these dinosaurs are supposed to be at least 65 million years old, there shouldn't be any carbon-14 left in them. But guess what? We find carbon-14 still in these bones. More recently, they discovered soft tissue and red blood cells in dinosaur bones. It was shocking to them. Dr. Mary Schweitzer, who found some of this and publicized it early on, she was shocked by it herself. When she was looking at a T-Rex femur, she saw something that looked like soft tissue and red blood cells, but she told herself, of course it can't be because we know these bones are 65 million years old. The more she looked at it, the more she was convinced this is really soft tissue. Her colleagues would not believe her. She herself said, I did the test 17 times. And she was finally convinced this is really soft tissue she's dealing with. And they determined it's not from contamination, it's actually from the dinosaur bones. Now, what did the other scientists do in reaction? They all said, I guess we've been wrong about evolution. Let's go to church and worship Jesus. No, they didn't do that. They said, there must be something in nature that can preserve these materials for millions and millions of years. They need to save their paradigm, their worldview. They will never give that up. They're just going to say this changes everything, and then they have wishful thinking that something in nature could preserve these materials. They talk about the presence of iron and other things. Skipping the details, that doesn't cut it. There's no way that these materials could last for hundreds of thousands or multiple millions of years. They degrade way too fast for that. And more recently, now we even have DNA in dinosaur bones. DNA is even more fragile than red blood cells and soft tissue. It should not be there, but it fits in very well with the biblical account that there was a flood about 4,500 years ago. Some of those creatures got buried and preserved, and we would expect to see some of these materials still in those fossils because they're really not millions of years old, only a few thousand years old. Next question, did dinosaurs turn into oil? Very popular belief. Here's a picture of a gas station not too far from where I live in Wisconsin, Sinclair gas station. You might be familiar with them. Their very famous sign has a picture of like a brontosaurus on it. The idea is that dinosaurs lived millions of years ago and their bodies slowly over millions of years turned into oil. Here's a label on one of their oil cans. It said mellowed 100 million years. So over millions and millions of years, their bodies slowly turned into oil. Well, there's a problem with that story. The millions of years myth. Oh, we all know as a fact it takes millions of years to create oil and coal and diamonds and things like that, right? Well, look at this article here from Manchester University. We're doing in 10 minutes what has taken nature 150 million years to do. That is shocking to them that this can happen very quickly. It doesn't take time to produce oil or coal. It takes the right conditions. It takes organic material, heat, pressure, and water. That's exactly what the flood would have provided. Would have buried all the organic material on the earth under all these layers, producing a lot of pressure, causing heat, and then you have all the water from the flood. It wouldn't take long at all to turn these seams into coal and into oil. So did dinosaurs turn into oil? Probably some of their bodies contributed, but most of it was vegetation that turned into oil and coal. But it didn't take a long period of time. It just took the right effects, and the flood gives us that very situation. Next question. Did dinosaurs and man ever live together? Again, crazy meter going off the scale on this one because people know dinosaurs died out millions of years ago, long before people were even on the planet. So skeptics laugh at us for this one, but even many Christians saying, well, now you're going too far. There's no way that dinosaurs and people ever lived at the same time. The related question, is there any evidence for this? That's what we would really need. Is there any evidence to make sense of the idea and concept of man and dinosaur living together at the same time? Well, here I have absolute proof that dinosaurs and people live together. You got the Flintstones here. Now, this is just kind of my bad sense of humor here. Secular scientists don't like this cartoon at all because it gives you the impression that maybe people and dinosaurs did live together at the same time, but they don't believe that at all. But more seriously, what are the lines of evidence that would back up the biblical narrative that God created dinosaurs and man the same week and actually on the same day, and that they would have lived together for a period of time? What's the evidence for that? Well, we have 4 lines of evidence. We have cultural references, we have historical accounts and sightings, paintings, carvings, and artifacts, and then fossil footprints. So let's take a look at some of these, starting with the cultural references. We see references to things like this all over the world, dragon legends in particular, all over the planet. Now, we're going to tie in the concept of dragons a little bit later in the series, but let's take a look at this. We've got stories from the Americas and China and Europe and Africa, all over the planet. China is probably the most well-known. You go there and it's just replete all over their culture, in their writings, in their artworks, in their monuments and buildings, throughout their culture. Pictures of these dragons. You go to a Chinese restaurant, you probably see the zodiac on your placemat. 12 creatures here, just kind of normal creatures. You've got the ox and the dog and the rabbit, but then they also have a dragon, giving you the impression that they just saw dragons as being another creature that was around with all those other creatures. And even over in Wales, the Welsh flag. My wife and I have been over there when I was speaking, and we saw it throughout their culture as well. It's on their national flag. But then you think about dragons, you think, well, that's fantasy, right? I mean, they make up all these stories. There's no way that something like this ever really existed. Well, take a look at this dinosaur that they've discovered. It's called Dracoryx. looks very similar to this dragon that we just looked at. In fact, if you put wings on this guy, he looks very similar to that dragon. And so we could call it a dinosaur, but we could also call it a dragon. There's a lot of similarities, and there's a lot of stories and sightings and accounts that they use the word dragon to refer to, and they're very similar to what we would call a dinosaur. So we're going to look at now historical accounts and sightings, look at some ancient ones, some more that are relatively recent, and then some biblical references as well. Starting out with the ancient accounts here. The first one is from Herodotus, 5th century Greek historian. He wrote this: "There is a place in Arabia, not far from the town of Buto, where I went to learn about the winged serpents. When I arrived there, I saw innumerable bones and backbones of serpents, many heaps of backbones, great and small, and even smaller. Winged serpents are said to fly from Arabia at the beginning of spring, making for Egypt. But the ibis birds encounter the invaders in this pass and kill them. The serpents are like water snakes. Their wings are not feathered, but very like the wings of a bat." Sounds very much like the description of some kind of a dinosaur, and he's just talking about it as a factual historical account. Another account comes from Alexander the Great, 356 to 323 BC, king of Macedonia. This is what he said: "When Alexander threw some parts of India into a commotion and took possession of others, he encountered among many other animals a serpent which lived in a cavern and was regarded as sacred by the Indians, who paid it great and superstitious reverence. Now as the army passed by the cavern and caused a noise, the serpent was aware of it, and it hissed and snorted so violently that all were terrified and confounded. It was reported to measure 70 cubits, that's about 105 feet, although it was not visible in all its length, for it only put its head out. Its eyes are said to have been the size of a large round Macedonian shield." Very interesting account, again, just straightforward history. He's not saying that this is mythological. Then we have Marco Polo, 13th century explorer. He said, "In this province are found snakes and great serpents of such a vast size as to strike fear into those who see them, and so hideous that the very account of them must excite the wonder of those who hear it. You may be assured that some of them are 10 paces in length, some are more and some are less. They have 2 forelegs near the head, but for foot nothing but a claw like the claw of a hawk or that of a lion. The head is very big and the eyes are bigger than a great loaf of bread. The mouth is large enough to swallow a man whole and is garnished with great pointed teeth. And in short, they are so fierce looking and so hideously ugly that every man and beast must stand in fear and trembling of them." Again, another very interesting story from history. Then we have St. George and the Dragon. Now, this is a mythological story, but it ties in very closely to other things that we've been reading. As the story goes, the people of the city around there had to offer 2 sheep to this dragon, later on human sacrifices, which ended up including the king's daughter. St. George supposedly came by and he was going to rescue the king's daughter from the dragon. And he refused a great reward, asking only that the people consider Christ. He said, "I don't need a reward for what I've done. I just want you to consider Christianity and the claims of Christ." Again, ties in fairly closely with these other historical accounts that we've heard. And we have the story of Beowulf, the ancient Anglo-Saxon account, a poem written somewhere between 700 and 1000 AD. The hero Beowulf fights and kills 2 dragons, Grendel and its mother. About 50 years later, Beowulf faces another dragon, this time losing his own life in the fight. Again, another historical account of interactions of humans with things that they were calling dragons, which sometimes sound like what we would call dinosaurs. Well, those are ancient accounts. Next, we'll take a look at what we call relatively recent accounts and sightings. These sightings occur again all over the world, which makes them even more interesting. We're not talking about T-Rex running rampant through New York City or anything like that. It's a little bit different. We don't expect to see those types of scenes. But here's our first account. We're going to go to the Congo region of Africa in the dense jungle. The natives there describe something they've seen, and they actually call it Mekele Membe, creature that seems very much like a sauropod dinosaur, and they talk about it very casually as something that they've actually seen. Then we have another account from Papua New Guinea. Very interesting account just north of Australia there. There's another jungle, and in it they describe something that they say has a long tail and a long neck. The length is 32 to 49 feet. It looked like a very large wallaby, head like a turtle, shiny brown skin, and walked on two legs. Sounds kind of crazy, but we actually have evidence of a dinosaur called a Tyrannosaurus. Now, very interesting looking dinosaur, but we have fossils of that, and it matches up somewhat with what these natives are describing in Papua New Guinea. We have another sighting in Scotland in the United Kingdom. This one you're probably going to be fairly familiar with, and it has to do with Loch Ness. When you think of Loch Ness, everyone thinks of the Loch Ness Monster. Here's the original famous photograph that was taken in 1934. This is actually a fraud. A doctor put a little boat together and made this clay thing, whatever, that looks like the neck of maybe a plesiosaur, put it out in the water, took pictures of it, became very famous, and so everyone was all enamored by the Loch Ness Monster. Now, since this, many other people have claimed to see something in Loch Ness. Some of those people were a little strange. We don't necessarily believe what they say, but there's a lot of very credible people claiming to have seen something. So most likely there was something out there, but we still to this date aren't sure exactly what it was that they were seeing. So what do these stories have in common? Just that, they are stories. Does that mean that none of them are true? No. Does that mean that they are true because someone said that? No, they're stories, and we need to keep that in mind. So we don't use them as proof of anything, but they're very interesting specifically because they've come from all over the world. In fact, the stories are so strong and so consistent that even evolutionists have had to come up with a response to it. They can't just write them off because they're coming from so many different sources and they have so many different similarities. So they come up with what we call a rescuing device. What's that? A rescuing device is kind of an excuse you come up with to explain away facts you're seeing in spite of what you believe. You don't want to give up your belief system, your paradigm, your worldview, your starting point. That's not going to change in your mind. So you're trying to explain why it is that we're seeing these facts that don't seem to fit well with what you believe. And here's one of their rescuing devices. Comes from Carl Sagan. He was one of the world's leading atheists, very intelligent scientist. This was his response as to why there are so many common stories from all over the planet, from people living at different times that didn't even know each other. This is what he said. There are fossil memories of the time of dinosaurs come down to us through general mammalian memory, inherited from the early mammals, our ancestors, who had to compete with great predatory lizards. What's he saying? He's saying we have evolved from mammals, and some of those mammals millions of years ago were living when dinosaurs were around, and they were afraid of dinosaurs, and their memories of these dinosaurs were actually passed down through evolution. So these people writing these stories, they didn't actually see dinosaurs, they just have these remnant memories from ancestors from millions of years ago, and they think they're seeing these things. I think that's a great stretch, and that is not a good rescuing device that really doesn't account for what we're actually seeing. Let me take a look at the mosasaur. This creature was 50 feet long, lived in the ocean, so technically we probably wouldn't call it a dinosaur. Dinosaurs were generally creatures that were living on land. But I'm going to put a scuba diver up here. Now we're going to shrink the scuba diver down to scale. This gives you an idea of how big this creature really was. So it doesn't take much imagination to envision this guy coming up out of the ocean and scaring people on a ship, maybe even capsizing a ship. And there are so many stories of sailors encountering creatures like this. I don't think that they're all mythological. Many, many stories having a lot of things in common of sea creatures, again, capsizing ships, or at least them sighting these things over time. Sometimes they might get embellished where the dragon was breathing fire and burnt up the whole ship. Yeah, that can happen over time. Could dragons breathe fire? Possibly. The Bible actually hints at that, and we'll take a look at that a little later in the series here. So those were the recent accounts. Now we'll take a look at the biblical accounts and occurrences, and specifically the references to the word dragon. This word appears 21 times in the King James translation. Here's an example, Psalm 91:13. Thou shalt tread upon the lion and the adder, or the snake. The young lion and the dragon shall thou trample under feet. It's talking about normal animals here, and it just throws in the word dragon as if that's another normal animal that was around. And we have Isaiah 43:20. The beasts of the field shall honor me, the dragons and the owls, because I give waters to the wilderness. Again, another natural reference to dragons along with other normal creatures. And then in Jeremiah 49:33, and Hazor shall be a dwelling place for dragons, and a desolation forever. There shall be no man abide there, nor any son of man dwell in it. Again, these are just very straightforward accounts of normal animals, and it also uses the word dragon. So biblically speaking, you get the impression that dragons were animals that were coexisting with the other animals and also with people at the same time. Additional references from the Bible, one that you're probably familiar with, and that is the term behemoth. Job 40 verse 15, behold now behemoth, which I made with these. It's very important to look at the context here to see how is behemoth being described. And here's what it says. It said, he moveth his tail like a cedar tree, which is huge. He is a chief of the ways of God. Behold, he drinketh up a river. He can draw up the Jordan into his mouth. When you read these verses and try to figure out what's being described here, it doesn't seem to match up with any current creatures around, but it does seem to match up very well with something like a large sauropod. So it sounds like God is talking to Job about a dinosaur, and this is after the flood. Now, what's interesting is many of our Bibles have footnotes in them. And I think footnotes can be very helpful to us, but we need to keep in mind that footnotes are not the inspired Word of God. They're additional commentary that men and women have added to help us better understand certain passages. And most of the instances, I think they are very helpful. But they could potentially be off. And here's an example where, in my opinion, I think they're a little bit off. Job chapter 40, verse 15, where we're talking about behemoth. There is a superscript there, meaning there's a footnote at the bottom. You scroll to the bottom and it says possibly the hippopotamus or an elephant. So behemoth in their mind was probably just a normal animal like a hippopotamus or an elephant. Well, does a hippopotamus have a tail like a cedar tree? No, not even close. Some people say, okay, it probably wasn't a hippo, it was probably an elephant because elephants are bigger than hippos. Yes, elephants are bigger. They're not really that big. To scale, they're more like this. But elephants don't really have tails like hippos either. It really doesn't match up well with that at all. I think it matches up much better with something like a large sauropod. They have huge tails. You probably know the story of Job. Job went through a lot of problems in his life, a lot of trials, and towards the end, Job starts questioning God. And then God kind of says, well, hold on, Job there. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? And then he says, consider behemoth that I made with you. I don't think that God is saying, Job, I know you've had a lot of trials in your life, went through an awful lot, but hey, look at the hippo. Job looks at the hippo and says, oh, I feel so much better about my life. No, I think he says, consider behemoth. And Job looks 40 feet up in the air at the head of this large sauropod. And Job says, I think I get your point. You're God, I'm not. I'm just going to close my mouth now and listen. I believe that that's what's happening in this passage, which again is after the flood. Then we have Job 41, the next chapter. The entire chapter talks about a creature called Leviathan. Very interesting creature. Here's a few things that it tells us, just a few highlights. Verse 10 says, none is so fierce that dare stir him up. Verses 19 through 21, out of his mouth go burning lamps, and sparks of fire leap out. Out of his nostrils go a smoke, as out of a seething pot or cauldron. His breath kindleth coals, and a flame goeth out of his mouth. Verse 25, When he riseth up himself, the mighty are afraid. Verses 27 and 29. He esteemeth iron as straw, and brass as rotten wood. Darts are counted as stubble. He laugheth at the shaking of a spear. And then in verse 33, upon the earth there is not his like, who is made without fear. This sounds very distinct. It really doesn't seem to match up with any creatures that we see today. It sounds like something very different. But let's take a look at one creature that seems somewhat similar to this. That would be the crocodile. Now, a fairly large crocodile today would be about 18 feet long. For scale, we'll put a 6-foot man over there. You get the impression this guy's pretty big. Well, some commentators think that this Leviathan was something we call a super croc. We have fossil evidence of these crocs being 39 feet long. We call it a super croc. You could imagine that when this thing would rise up, everyone would be afraid, and you can't capture this thing. So very likely Leviathan was something like a super croc, a real creature that actually existed. So next we're going to take a look at paintings, carvings, and artifacts, but you're going to have to wait again till part 3 where we cover that as well as a few other questions. We trust that you're enjoying this series as we go along talking about dinosaurs, but using them to ultimately talk about the authority of God. So as a summary, we talked about how old dinosaur fossils are. We looked at dinosaurs. Did they turn into oil? And did dinosaurs and man ever live together? We're in the middle of that. We're going to continue that at the beginning of part 3. We hope you can join us.
We hope you enjoyed this presentation and trust it was an encouragement to you. For more information about our ministry and resources, visit us online at thestartingpointproject.com.